When a whip came down on Cypress Bend Plantation, it did not always stop at one back. They said that when Elias cried out, far across the fields, his brother Isaiah would flinch in his sleep, and purple shadows would rise under the skin that no leather had touched. That sounds like a story people tell in the dark. It was not. It sat for years in dry ink, in the plantation ledger of Thomas Wainwright, in the cramped hand of a country doctor named Walter Keene, and in a margin note in the book of a small white church that spoke of colored twins bearing the same stripes. The first entry is from the winter of 1861, in the sandy, cold fields of North Florida, where the pines leaned over the swamps and the damp got into every bone. Cypress Bend lay between the cotton rows and the black water of the marsh, a place where you could hear frogs at night and chains at dawn. Elias and Isaiah were 10, maybe 11, born in the slave quarters, tall for their age, always together. That morning they were separated, Elias in the yard near the gin house, Isaiah back by the cabins under their mother Rachel's watchful eye. The reason for the whipping was small enough to lose in time. Mr. Cole, the overseer, said Elias had slipped a few ears of corn or slowed the line to shield an older man. On a place like Cypress Bend, the difference hardly mattered. Cole needed his lesson. The boy was the lesson. The hands were called to watch. The yard was a hard-packed patch of earth, gray under a low sky. Elias's wrists were tied to the post. Breath steamed in the cold. The white men pulled their coats tight. The black men and women had only thin cloth and each other. When the first stripe landed across Elias's shoulders, the sound cracked the air. His body jerked, a choked cry leaving his throat. Half a mile away, in a dim cabin that smelled of smoke and damp wood, Isaiah stiffened where he sat beside his mother. No one had touched him. He grabbed at his own back, eyes wide, and fell forward with a shout that made Rachel drop the mending from her hands. "Boy, what's got into you?" one of the women asked, reaching for him. Before anyone could answer, a red welt rose under Isaiah's shirt, as if an invisible lash had just torn his skin. Another line followed, and another, in the same cruel rhythm that echoed faintly from the yard. In the quarters, women screamed and crossed themselves in their own ways. Aunt Millie, the old midwife, began to murmur words older than English. One man backed away, whispering, "Mark of the ancestors," while another fell to his knees, praying to Jesus to look away. Out in the yard, some of the field hands shifted uneasily. They could not see Isaiah, but they could hear something. A second cry, thinner, coming from the direction of the cabins, folding itself around Elias's hoarse voice like harmony in a terrible hymn. When Cole was done, Elias hung limp, his back a ladder of bleeding, stripes. By then, word had already flown ahead of him. By the time they cut the ropes and dragged him toward the cabins, people were gathered in the doorway, staring past the bruised boy to the pallet where Isaiah lay, shaking, with the same pattern written across his skin. Thomas Wainwright did not like mysteries on his land. That afternoon, he rode down from the big house, boots polished, coat buttoned tight, anger held in the set of his jaw. He demanded to know who had dared to lay a hand on the second boy without his order. "No one, sir," Mr. Cole stammered. "Ain't nobody touched him." So they hauled Isaiah up, stripped his shirt away in the icy air, and Wainwright saw it himself. The twin map of wounds, fresh and angry, matching the marks on Elias, as if the whip had traced the same path twice. "Tricks," he said at first, "Negro mischief." He accused them of scratching themselves, of plotting to shame the overseer. But the boys were too shaken even to answer, and the older slaves would not meet his eyes. Wainwright sent for a doctor. Dr. Walter Keene came down from Tallahassee in a muddy buggy, a thin man with tired eyes and careful hands. He examined Elias first, Then Isaiah, running his fingers gently over the raw skin, measuring their pulses, listening to their chests. Injuries correspond, he noted in a small leather notebook. Pattern of lesions identical, both febrile, pupils reactive. He used words like sympathetic disturbance and nervous imitation, long phrases meant to fence off whatever he felt crawling at the edge of his understanding. To test his theory, he asked for a pin. He pressed it suddenly into the flesh of Elias's upper arm. The boy flinched. A drop of blood welled up. Across the room, Isaiah jerked and clapped a hand to his own arm in the same place. When they rolled back his sleeve, a tiny bead of blood was already forming, as if summoned through skin that had never been pierced. Dr. Keene cleared his throat, wrote faster. To Wainwright he spoke of hysterical sympathy, of boys so bound up in each other they might harm themselves without knowing it. But later, alone with his notebook, he allowed one raw sentence. I cannot, in honesty, fully account for the simultaneity. The overseer left muttering about devils. Some of the slaves whispered the same word, but they did not mean the same thing by it. If that had been the end, you might call it an odd day, a story to frighten children. But it was not the end. In the plantation book for 1861, there are 11 separate punishments marked for the twins and those around them. In Dr. Keene's notes, there are 22 bodies recorded with matching wounds. And all of that was written down before the day when the bruises rose on the skin of a boy who, by every account in those same records, was already dead. If you're still with me after that first scene, you can feel how wrong this story sits. 2 boys on a backwater plantation hurting in the same pattern, miles apart. That's the kind of thing folks like to file under old folks talk and move on. The difference here is simple. Somebody wrote it down. While you're listening, do me a favor. Drop a comment and tell me where you're from. Are you watching this from the Deep South, from New York, from the Midwest Plains? I'm always curious how a tale like this lands in different corners of the country, because for some people this is just history, and for others, it's family. And if these darker corners of the American story speak to you, you already know what to do. You can subscribe, hit that little bell, so you don't miss the cases the school books skipped on purpose. Because this isn't just a ghostly story about strange twins. At its heart, it's about a system built on the idea that black bodies were livestock on a ledger, then forced to confront the possibility that those same bodies carried a bond no white owner could measure or fence in. Every time enslaved people stopped looking like replaceable hands and started looking like mysteries, the system panicked. It tried to crush the mystery into a neat column of symptoms in a medical notebook, or shove it into the pulpit as the devil's work. Anything but admit that the people it owned might have depths no bill of sale could touch. So where does what you're hearing come from? Some of it lies in dusty county records from North Florida, Leon and Gadsden, thin books where a neat white hand recorded punishments, transfers, deaths. In one of those ledgers, next to the name Isaiah, there's a note. Scars not accounted for by prior discipline. Another piece surfaced in the 1930s when the Keene family home was cleaned out. In a trunk under moth-eaten uniforms, someone found a small leather journal, Dr. Walter Keene's private notes. In between his complaints about fever season and bad roads, there are pages on a colored twin exhibiting mirrored injuries. Then there's the church. In the First Methodist of Tallahassee, Reverend Samuel Pratt kept a careful book of his own. One margin note, half blurred by time, mentions colored twins with marks of Satan's lash, seen during a visit to a plantation west of town. The dates line up with Keene's trips. Decades later, during the WPA Federal Writers Project, an elderly woman sat on a porch and told a young interviewer about 2 boys on Cypress Bend who got whipped together, even when only one was there. In the transcript, the interviewer adds in brackets, "Speaker shows old scarring on back, says it belongs to both of us." Now, here's where it gets uneasy. Those records don't sit together neatly. Parts are missing. A run of pages is cut cleanly out of Keene's journal. In the county archive, the very months when the strangest entries should appear are marked. Water damage. Yet the rest of the volume is dry. The church book has a gap in the same year, a strip torn where Pratt's notes should be. And still, enough remains to trace a faint line forward. After the war, one of the boys, only one, turns up under a new heading. In a memorandum filed by Army medical staff, there's a reference to an interesting nervous case from Florida. Former slave, twin, reports sympathetic pains at distance. The end of that memorandum is stamped. Further observations held in restricted file. Around the same period, a brief note appears in the proceedings of a Florida medical society. A committee is convened to consider what they call, in cold Latinized language, a Negro sympathetic condition. They meet with the young man once, maybe twice. After one particular session, the minutes break off mid-sentence. The topic never returns. So before we talk about those sessions, about what Confederate doctors and later Army men tried to do with a boy whose nerves seemed to reach past his own skin, we have to go back. Back before the ledger books and the doctor's ink. Back to the night when Rachel brought 2 sons into a leaking cabin, and an old woman looked at them and said they were not quite 2 at all. Because if you don't understand how Elias and Isaiah entered this world, you will not believe what was done to them when the war came. In 1849, on Cypress Bend Plantation in North Florida, 2 boys were born during a storm in a leaking slave cabin. Rachel labored on a straw pallet, fear sitting heavy on her chest. She had already lost children to the traitor and to the grave. At her feet knelt Aunt Millie, the gray-wrapped woman the quarters trusted for births and last breaths. Thunder rolled, rain beat the boards. Millie told her to push, and the first baby slid into her hands, warm, breathing, but silent. "He too quiet," someone whispered. Before panic took hold, a second pain seized Rachel. The next boy came hard and fast, as if pulled after the first by something unseen. Lightning flashed through the cracks. For a heartbeat, the whole room went still. The second child cried, thin and sharp, and in that same instant, the first boy's mouth opened with the same torn sound. Their fists jerked together, legs kicking like one small body cut in 2. Millie pressed their foreheads together and murmured words older than the big house. "This ain't 2 spirits," she said low so Rachel would hear. "This one split." Rachel pulled them against her. She had sworn not to love any baby too much again, but both boys shook in the same pattern in her arms, and that oath broke. Whoever had tied them together had not asked Thomas Wainwright's leave, and that thought gave her more strength than any sermon. From their first steps, the twins moved through plantation life as if a line ran under their skin. They slept on one pallet, limbs tangled, breath rising and falling together. If Elias rolled, Isaiah rolled. When Elias laughed at some small joke in the yard, Isaiah at the well would look up and smile without knowing why. Rachel watched, torn between hope that such a bond might keep them together and fear of what it meant in a world owned by other men. The first time their tie carried pain across distance, they were about 6. Isaiah was outside, climbing a low pecan tree with the others. Elias sat on the cabin floor beside Rachel, shelling peas. A branch cracked. Isaiah fell, leg twisting, and screamed. Inside that same instant, Elias jerked upright, grabbed his own shin and cried, "Mama, my leg! It burnin'!" Rachel caught him. There was no mark, only shaking. Before she could scold him, the door flew open and a little girl gasped. "Saya fell from the tree, Miss Rachel. Say his leg on fire." They carried Isaiah in, ankle swelling. As Aunt Millie bounded, she watched Elias. Each time the cloth bit into Isaiah's sore flesh and he hissed, Elias's body flinched too. That night, by the coals, Millie looked from one sleeping boy to the other. "You keep them close as you can," she told Rachel. "If one steps into shadow, other gon' feel it. White folks don't like what they can't rule in our flesh." On a place where boys were counted like tools, even keeping them in the same row was more wish than plan, so their strangeness stayed inside the cabins. They held their tongues and turned away from the small proofs of that invisible line. And that silence might have held until the twins turned 8, and real leather finally fell on one back, the day when the marks rose on 2. By 1857, the twins were big enough to keep pace in the rows. Not men, not even close, but old enough that Mr. Cole no longer called them boys with any softness in it. 8 years on that soil had taught them how to bend under the sun and keep their eyes low. One hot afternoon, the line in the cotton field slowed. An older man, his back twisted from earlier seasons, lagged behind. Elias eased his own steps, letting his sack drag so the old man could catch up, taking part of the blame into his own shoulders without saying a word. Cole saw only numbers slipping. He rode up, jaw tight, and barked, "You there, don't you drag my line." His crop in one hand, reins in the other, he singled Elias out the way a hawk chooses one chicken. When nobody would name the true straggler, the choice was made. Elias was ordered out of the row and marched toward the whipping post near the sheds. Dust stuck to the sweat on his neck. Behind him, heads dipped. No one dared meet his eyes. Back by the cabins, Isaiah was in the dimness with Rachel, Aunt Millie, and the other women, sorting worn clothes, mending where they could. The open door let in a slice of glare and the far-off murmur of the field. Isaiah stiffened. His hands went flat on the table. "Ma," he whispered, but the word broke in half. His body arched, a hoarse cry ripping out of him as he clawed at his back. "Boy!" Rachel grabbed for him, thinking seizure, fever, some sudden fit. His skin was dry, his eyes clear, yet under his shirt something was happening. A red line swelled up across his shoulders, as if drawn by an invisible hand. The second stroke landed out at the post. The sound of leather and air came faint through the pines. Inside, Isaiah jerked again. Another welt rose, crossing the first. One woman shrieked and stumbled backward, knocking over a stool. Another started praying so fast the words blurred. Someone fainted where she stood. Aunt Millie yanked the shirt up. 4. Then 5 livid stripes lay there, wet and new. Following a pattern the women on Cypress Bend knew far too well. "Lord have mercy," one breathed. "Ain't nobody touch him." In the field, men kept their faces pointed at the dirt, but they heard the extra screaming from the quarters, cutting across Elias's own. The air itself seemed to tighten. When the sun went down and the chores were done, the quarters buzzed like a hive kicked open. Some whispered that the old ones from across the water had taken pity on Rachel, tying her children so no traitor could split them. "Their hurt walk together," an old woman said, rocking herself. "White man hit one. Heaven make him see, he beating too." Others were not comforted. A tall man named Jacob, worn thin by years and lashes, glared at the twins' corner. "This ain't blessing," he muttered. "This trouble. White folks see this. They gon' say we cursed, and we all pay." Aunt Millie spread a worn cloth on the dirt and dropped small bones and seeds from a pouch, tracing lines in the dust with a knotted finger. Their pain don't travel by foot, she told Rachel. It got its own road. Spirit road. When his hand rise, she tipped her chin toward the big house. It can't stay on just one back. After that day, people watched the boys differently. Once, near the cookhouse, Elias brushed against a hot iron pot and hissed as his wrist blistered. Hours away in the rows, Isaiah straightened up with a gasp, staring at his own wrist, where angry bubbles were forming under clean skin. Another time, the children played hiding games. They covered Isaiah's eyes and spun him around, sent Elias running between cabins. Isaiah pointed, walking straight to the right doorway every time, as if led by a string no one else could see. Some of the younger ones laughed. A few backed away, palms damp. Then there was the night they both woke screaming about dark water. No one had drowned that day. Still, they sat bolt upright in the half-light, clutching at their chests. "Ma, he was going under," they said together, voices overlapping. It pulled us down. Word of such things was supposed to stay where the lanterns smoked and the floorboards creaked. But fear works its own edges. Dinah, a kitchen woman who dreaded any mark that might draw a white gaze toward her children, leaned too close to a white housemaid by the back steps and whispered about witch twins who shared stripes. The maid crossed herself and carried the talk uphill to the big house, clumsy with second-hand fear. That night, Aunt Millie knelt by the pallet where the twins slept and murmured over them in a tongue Rachel only half understood, laying old herbs at their feet. "World outside already listening," she said quietly. "Next time the lash come down, it won't be just the whip man watching. It'll be the master's own eyes." By 1859, the twins stood in the yard, while Thomas Wainwright rode out to count what his ledger said he owned. Elias had crossed Mr. Cole that week. Cotton had vanished from a shed. Someone had hidden it for the cabins. Elias knew who and kept quiet. Here, silence could be a crime. "Bring that one here," Wainwright said. They led Elias to the whipping post. Isaiah stayed in the crowd beside Rachel, fists tight. Cole lifted the whip. "You talk or you take it." Elias looked once toward the older men he'd shielded and said nothing. Leather cracked. The first stripe opened his back. Isaiah folded as if hit. A broken cry burst out. He clutched his spine. Rachel pulled him close, thinking he was fainting, until heat pulsed under his shirt. She yanked the cloth up. A bright welt was rising over his skin in the place the lash had cut Elias. A second blow fell. Isaiah jerked again. Another bar of red came up, crossing the first. For a moment, the yard held its breath. "Strip him!" Wainwright snapped. They tore Isaiah's shirt away. Across the yard, Elias sagged, his back a bleeding pattern. On Isaiah's smaller body, the same pattern glared back, line for line, as if one back had been copied onto the other. Wainwright sent for Dr. Walter Keene. The doctor arrived in a dusty buggy and examined Elias first, then Isaiah, fingers quick. "Lesions match," he murmured into a notebook. "Depth, placement, time." He asked for a pin. Without warning, he stuck it into Elias's thigh. Elias flinched. Isaiah jerked and grabbed the same spot. When Keene rolled up his trouser leg, a pinprick of blood was already forming on skin no one had touched. To the master, he spoke of sympathetic reaction, excited nerves, boys, too bound up in each other's minds. In his notes, he wrote only, "Accuracy not explained." Science did not quiet Wainwright, so he turned to the church. Samuel Pratt came from Tallahassee, collar wilted, Bible under his arm. He questioned the boys, prayed over them, pressed a palm to each bowed head, then drew Wainwright aside. "If this is not deceit," he said, "it is a snare. Correct them. Pray. And if it remains, part them. Better to lose one than have your place known for such things." Keene asked. Leave to observe again, under tighter conditions. He wanted to see how far the link went. Wainwright stood between the doctor's appetite for proof and the preacher's fear of scandal, his thoughts on his name in the county. In a world where a black child can be listed beside a mule, what do you call it when his skin answers to something no master commands? Miracle, sickness, or danger? You can answer in the comments. On Cypress Bend, the men in charge chose danger. Whatever this was, it had to be tamed or buried. So they agreed on a next step. The day they carried it out, the whip would not just punish, it would measure. And the thing to be laid open would be the bond between two boys who had never learned how to hurt alone. Dr. Keene came back to Cypress Bend with a small bag and a notebook, not mercy. Wainwright had agreed to one clear test. If the stories about the twins were foolishness, this would end them. If not, he wanted to see how deep the trouble ran before the county heard. They chose a still, hard morning. Isaiah was taken first, shut alone in a narrow storeroom beside the smokehouse, among barrels and salt. Jacob, the same older man who had once called the boys trouble, was set to guard the door. Out in the yard, they tied Elias to the frame. The others were held back by the sheds like cattle at a fence. Keene took the boy's pulse, glanced at the sky, wrote the hour. "Begin," he said. The first stroke landed. An instant later, something crashed against the storeroom door from inside. Isaiah's cry followed, high and ripped, as if leather had found him too. Jacob stared at the latch. No one had gone in or out. The second blow sounded. Again Isaiah hit the boards. Again that broken shout. Between strokes, Jacob opened the door a crack. Isaiah was alone on the floor, doubled over, hands locked on his back. As Jacob watched, long red bars pushed through the thin shirt in time with the whip outside. A man who had spent his life saying hurt was just the way of things, felt his knees go soft. A prayer slipped out of him before he could swallow it. When it was over, they cut Elias down and dragged him in. Heat rolled off his skin. Isaiah crawled to him, but even a light touch made Elias jerk. "Don't," Elias whispered. "It'll jump on you." "When you far, it all yours," Isaiah said. "When I close, we cut it. Let me hold my peace." That night, Rachel heard them whisper and knew they had begun to fear their bond more than they trusted it. The next day she went to Aunt Millie. "You said they tied," she said. "Ask whoever did it to ease it. I don't care what we offend." Millie hesitated, then nodded once. On a moonless night, they slipped with the twins to the edge of the swamp. Millie laid roots and bits of iron on the wet ground, whispered, to names Rachel knew only from songs, begging that beating one boy would no longer make two bodies jump. They were seen. A young white helper watched the shapes at the water and carried the word witch work up to the big house. By morning, Wainwright knew. They tied Aunt Millie to the same post where Elias had hung and whipped her before the quarters. "This land has one will," he said over her cries. "Not charms, not spirits. Mine." Later, in the cool of his study, he spoke low to Keene about Army doctors in Tallahassee who liked unusual cases. Passing the half-open door, Rachel heard the line that froze her. "If those officers care to examine such a wonder, I might be willing to part with one boy." For a price. For the first time, what bound her sons was being weighed like something on a sale list, and the war, already moving toward Florida, would soon give that thought a wagon and a road. By the first months of 1861, war talk rolled through Florida like distant thunder. Men in gray drilled near Tallahassee. Newspapers in the big house shouted about secession and honor, while the quarters worried about food and who might be sold to pay for guns. Wainwright saw his chance. A Confederate surgeon passed through Leon County, speaking with planters about supporting the cause. Wainwright pulled Dr. Keene aside. mentioned a singular Negro boy with nervous peculiarities, and asked whether the Army needed cases for study. A letter went out. Another came back with a neat reply. Yes, the camp infirmary would receive such a subject. No, they did not pay in cash, but consideration would be given. The choice fell on Elias. Isaiah, they said, was quieter, more useful in the rows. Also, even men who treated people as property knew you could not experiment very long on a boy who screamed every time you raised your hand. They came for Elias before dawn. Rachel wrapped both sons in her arms at the cabin door. "You take one. You slice the other in half," she told the driver, voice low and shaking. "Remember that when you lay your head down tonight." Aunt Millie hobbled up, ribs still aching from her own whipping. She pressed a small cloth bundle into Elias's palm, a twist of roots and a scrap of iron tied with thread. "Keep it on you," she said. "So whatever road you walk, your shadow know where to go back." The wagon rolled away, wheels grinding over hard ground. Isaiah ran until the chains on another man's ankles forced him to stop. For hours afterward, he felt a hollowness at his ribs, as if something had been scooped out. The separation did not bring peace. In the camp outside Tallahassee, Elias lay on a rough cot between wounded soldiers. Keene moved among them, now in Army pay, stopping often at the boy's side with his notebook. They cleaned an old cut on Elias's shoulder, then, for observation, opened it a little wider with a careful blade and bathed it in sharp-smelling iodine. On Cypress Bend that same morning, Isaiah was in the field. Without warning, he gasped, hand flying to his shoulder. Warmth spread under his shirt. When he looked, his fingers came away red. No overseer had struck him. Still, the skin there showed a fresh, straight slice. Word traveled faster than any wagon. Before nightfall, Keene had a note from a passing rider. The twin on the plantation had bled in the same place at nearly the same hour. He copied the message into his journal under a new heading. Case number 14, sympathetic Negro twin, distance approx. 20 miles. At night, the brothers met where no chain or road reached. In the infirmary, Elias woke, choking, heart pounding, the taste of river mud in his mouth. Across the miles, Isaiah sat up in the darkness of the cabin, chest heaving, coughing on air. Both had seen the same thing, a post sunk in black water, rope around two thin wrists, and a lash swinging above their joined shadows. "They showing us what they plan," Aunt Millie whispered when Isaiah told it, her face the color of ash. "Not what's done, what they fixing to do." In the camp, officers came to look at Elias as if he were some odd instrument. A younger doctor, Andrew McCall, tapped his chin and told Keene, "If his nerves truly answer at a distance, imagine the uses. A living wire to a plantation, to a town. Touch here. Feel there." Back on Cypress Bend, Isaiah became a walking weather glass for cruelties he could not see. Some mornings, he folded over with stomach cramps no food had earned. Other days, his chest clenched, and Rachel, without needing news, knew men in gray were trying something new on her lost son. Keene's notes grew longer, his words more careful. "Phenomenon intensifying," he wrote. "Reports from plantation increasingly precise. Link not diminished by removal. Possibly accessible to observers in physical contact with subject." He did not yet admit, even to himself, what that last line meant. They had believed that putting miles between the boys would thin whatever thread tied them. Instead, in the first year of war, it tightened. Their bodies no longer answered only to each other. Anyone standing too near began to feel a buzz under the skin when pain came. And before long, when a blow fell on one back, it would not stop at two. It did not take long for word to spread through the camp that there was a strange boy in the infirmary. Officers came on their way to the surgeon's tent, boots muddy, faces curious. They stood at the foot of Elias's cot, while Keene lifted the blanket, traced old scars, spoke of mirrored wounds on a plantation they would never see. Dr. Andrew McCall, younger than Keene, and far less troubled by what things cost, watched with a speculative look. "If his body reports what happens out there," he said, "that's more than a curiosity. Touch him here. Feel trouble there. A sort of human telegraph. Think what that could mean for an army that has plantations full of these people." To him it was not horror, just possibility. Keene bristled, then said nothing. His notes that night only hint at the exchange. Colleague suggests potential application. Deeply uneasy. The church sent its own set of eyes. Reverend Pratt arrived one gray afternoon, coat still smelling of pine and hymn book glue. He had heard of the boy in the camp and of the twin left at Cypress Bend. He insisted on speaking with Elias alone, then asked Keene for the latest reports from the plantation. When he'd heard enough, he closed his Bible around his fingers. "If we begin to treat this as gift," he told the doctors, "we imply the Lord has given something powerful into the hands of those He has clearly set below us in the order of things. You may call it connection. I call it temptation." He recommended stern correction with prayer. Long sessions meant to break whatever was happening until the boy's body answered only to the lash, not to mysteries. Back on the plantation, people argued over the same thing in different words. Some of the enslaved clung to Isaiah's link like a thin rope over deep water. When his ribs tightened, they said, "They working him hard today." When he clawed at his chest in the night, they knew without newspapers that the camp was not a place of healing. "It's the only way we know he's still under the sky," one woman told Rachel. "Else he gone like all the others. No trace." Others flinched every time he stumbled or gasped. Every spell might mean new questions from white mouths, new anger, new blame. "Every groan out of that boy," Jacob muttered, "is another reason for them to come down here with chains and scripture." Rachel measured each day by her son's breath. A quiet morning was mercy. A day of twitching and half-choked cries meant the camp was experimenting again. She began to dread the sound of his sleep as much as his pain, waiting for the next jolt that would tell her they'd picked up a knife or strap miles away. Then the boundary of the twins' suffering slipped. In the infirmary, during one of Elias's waves of pain, a hospital orderly held him to keep him from rolling off the cot. As the spasm peaked, the man yelped, dropping his grip, hand gone numb from elbow to wrist, as if the nerve inside had been struck. "Cramp," he said quickly, embarrassed. But later, he told another worker it felt like something ran through me from that boy. On Cypress Bend, a similar moment unfolded. Isaiah buckled in the yard, and a teenaged field hand grabbed his shoulders to keep him upright. A sharp heat shot up the helper's arm, so sudden he cursed aloud. For a moment his fingers could not unclench. No one wrote that down. It survived only in a line from an old woman's interview many years later. Those twins, they didn't hold all that hurt themselves. It jumped to whoever stood too close sometimes, like it looked for a place to go. Between camp, pulpit, and plantation, the men in charge began to feel surrounded by something that did not answer to rank. So they met, Keene with his journals, McCall with his ambitions, Pratt with his Bible, Wainwright with his fear for his name, and a Confederate officer with orders to keep the hospital useful. Keene argued for more observation, carefully controlled. McCall talked of strategic advantages. Pratt insisted that letting this continue unchecked would invite questions no sermon could smother. Wainwright wanted only to stop being whispered about as the man with the cursed slaves. They finally agreed on one course, a single, decisive trial that would push the bond to its limit. "If one of them can be made not to feel," the officer said, "we will know the truth of it. If the other still responds, we name it trickery. If he does not, then the matter is finished." No one asked what it would be like to be 12 years old with 5 grown men deciding how much pain your body could stand for the sake of their peace of mind. Put yourself in that place for a second. You're barely past childhood. You don't own your own name on paper, let alone your future. Yet a circle of owners, doctors, and a preacher are setting terms for whether you are allowed to hurt the way you were born to hurt. Would you call that justice, fate, or something darker? You can tell me in the comments, especially if you grew up where these camps and fields once stood. Because that meeting ended with a fixed day, a marked page in Keen's book, and a plan to see whether they could force one half of the twin bond into silence, and what would happen to the other when they tried. Keen marked the date in his small book, October 1861. No bulletin or sermon named it, but that was the day the men around him tried to force an answer out of 2 black children. In the Confederate infirmary, they pushed soldiers aside and strapped Elias upright to a wooden frame. Rope bit his wrists. Keen stood with pencil and watch. McCall held a wide strap. Reverend Pratt opened his Bible. "May what does not belong to God leave this body," he said. McCall snapped the strap in the air. Elias flinched. "Noise proves nothing," McCall muttered. "We need contact." The first real stroke crossed Elias's chest. He choked on air. On Cypress Bend, Isaiah was by the cabins with a bucket. His hands opened, the water spilled, and he folded, grabbing his ribs. Under his shirt, a red welt pushed up, sharp and clean. A second blow in the camp, a second band on the plantation. Children ran. Women closed in around Isaiah, tugging at his shirt, some praying, some trying to keep him from the ground, as more marks rose on untouched skin. In the infirmary, an orderly called the time. Chwantor wrote, "Simultaneous lesions on plantation twin. Distance C. 25 miles. Lag near 0. His letters were neat. His fingers were not. The officers who had come to laugh at stories stared and kept their mouths shut. McCall's thinking did not stop at proof. "If pain crosses, perhaps the edge of life does too," he said. "We should know." He urged one crushing blow high on the chest or neck. No one said kill, but everyone heard it. Pratt whispered something that sounded like consent dressed up as prayer. The chosen hit landed. Elias's head snapped back. Then his weight sagged on the ropes. Keen grabbed at his throat. The pulse there ran thin, then slipped beyond his reach. Miles away, Isaiah stiffened, clawed at the same place, and dropped. "Lias!" he managed. Then nothing. On the hard earth, he lay with his eyes half open. Rachel fell beside him, beating his chest, calling his name until her voice broke. For a span that felt longer than any sermon, both places were still. In the camp, men bent toward the hanging body. On Cypress Bend, hands hovered over a boy whose lungs would not move. Then both bodies jerked. Elias dragged in a torn breath that painted his lip with blood. A heartbeat later, Isaiah gasped, back arching like someone yanked out of deep water. Keen shouted, "He's here!" On the plantation, Rachel sobbed over her son, while Aunt Millie murmured that she had seen his spirit reach the door and be pulled back. No one present had words big enough for what they'd seen. They only knew this. Whatever tied those boys did not stop at miles, or at whatever line doctors called death. For the men who signed orders and guarded their reputations, that was not a wonder to publish. It was something to hide. And on Cypress Bend, hiding began the same way it always did, with torn pages, with burned scraps, and with someone quietly missing at roll call. In the camp after October's ordeal, Elias did not die, though some of the men half expected him to. He lay on a cot, color gone, breath catching shallow. Keene bent over him with cool fingers and a rigid hand on the pen. Severe collapse, followed by spontaneous recovery, he wrote. He did not add, brought on by us. Pratt stood at the foot of the bed, Bible shut. You have been shown enough, he said. On Cypress Bend, Isaiah did not leave his pallet for days. New welts crossed his back and chest where no whip had touched. Rachel sat beside him, counting breaths. Each hitch made her brace for the moment his body might stay, and the rest of him slip away to that camp road. When he finally sat up, stiff as an old man, the cabins went quiet. Back in the infirmary, the white men met again. Keene with his notes, McCall with his plans, Pratt with his fear, Wainwright with his standing in town, and a Confederate officer who needed beds for wounded soldiers. McCall argued for more trials. The officer cut him off. These cots are for men who carry rifles, not for a Negro experiment, he said. Pratt warned that if others heard, they would start asking why such a bond rested in slave flesh at all. We cannot invite that talk, he said. Wainwright saw whispers in every handshake, so they chose the cure they knew best. Silence. Keene went through his journal with a knife. Whole passages vanished, leaving case number 14 standing alone, stripped of the lines that made it frightening. The date, October 1861, remained. Beneath it, a few mild phrases about nervous weakness. At First Methodist, Pratt fed a stove fire with pages from his own book. A few sheets he kept, folded into another volume. On Cypress Bend, the plantation ledger for that autumn gained a jagged gap. The place where Isaiah's name should carry extra marks was labeled spoiled, water, though the rest of the paper was clean. As for Elias, the trail thins to a thread. In a military list, he appears once as transferred for further observation, destination unclear. After that, the ink moves on. No discharge, no grave, just a child who stops being named. Some say fever took him. Others whisper he never woke right after one more session. An old orderly later claimed he saw the boy left by the roadside when wagons filled with white wounded and the camp pulled out in haste. The record never settles it. Isaiah's path surfaces again after the war. Free at least in law, he stood before an agent of the Freedmen's Bureau in Tallahassee, giving his name, his former owner, the place he had worked. The clerk, glancing at the scars, asked, "How'd you come by all that?" Isaiah said, "They whipped my brother. The marks stayed on me." On the form, the agent wrote something smaller. "Back bears many old stripes, 'cause uncertain." If you've ever looked through those files or county books where you live, you know how often a life gets pressed into a single line. On Cypress Bend, and in that camp, they tried to bury this story with missing pages and missing boys. But paper is only one place a memory can live, and what happened to those twins kept breathing after the ledgers went still. By the time the century turned, Isaiah was just another black man trying to stay ahead of debt and bad weather in North Florida. He no longer lived on Cypress Bend. That place had half rotted after the war, sold and resold. Isaiah ended up in a small settlement outside Tallahassee, cutting timber one season, planting for a white landlord the next. On paper, he was a freedman. In his bones, he carried the old order. His back was a map no new doctor could read. Crossed lines, thick and thin, healed smooth, but never quite quiet. Some nights a familiar burn would start along his ribs for no present reason at all. If his hand brushed the bit of cloth Aunt Millie had once given Elias, kept all those years like a relic, the Pain came sharper, as if someone far off had been struck again. Children would ask, "Uncle Isaiah, who did that to you?" He'd answer, "They whipped my brother and forgot to count all the stripes." Sometimes he added the rest. How one boy was hauled away and both were punished. How he'd felt blows that never landed. Some of the younger folks nodded politely and later rolled their eyes. Old men, they said, made old stories larger. A line in his Freedmen's Bureau file, the one we touched on earlier, went into a wooden box with hundreds of other lives. The box moved from a bureau office to a county storeroom, then to a state archive, where it gathered dust on a steel shelf. A physician's notebook from the 1870s, kept in another crate, mentions a colored laborer who reports chest pangs whenever there is thunder, claims his brother perished at distance. No one linked those two pieces for generations. Then came the 1930s and the Federal Writers Project. A young interviewer, sent out with a notebook and a list of names, found an old man on the edge of a black neighborhood, either Isaiah himself, if he had outlived nearly everyone, or a relative who had listened carefully. "Them twins on Cypress Bend, you hear about them?" The transcript records. "One get beat, other one wear the marks. One gone, other still carry stripes for 2. On the margin, the interviewer scribbled a private note. "Story sounds fanciful. Scars on man's back are real. Very old." In the 1950s, a history teacher named Leonard Hayes at a small black college in Tallahassee stumbled across that transcript, then the bureau memo, then a fragile letter from Reverend Pratt that complained about twins with marks that mock God's order. Hayes started to stitch them together. He drafted an article for a local black newspaper and a campus journal, arguing that behind the folklore sat an actual case. The article, as far as we can tell, appeared once in a tiny run and was forgotten amid news of poll taxes and bus boycotts. But Hayes's folder, notes, clippings, hand-copied quotations, survived in the college archive. What you're hearing now leans on that folder, on a bundle of Keene family papers donated much later, on fragments of church records, on WPA interviews. Each one alone could be dismissed as rumor. Together, they outline the shadow of 2 boys who refused to hurt separately. If you've got elders who told you things that sounded impossible at the time, you can drop a comment about that. Especially if your people were once listed as someone else's property. Stories like that are often what's left when the ledgers go missing. And there is one more wrinkle. One of the diaries this whole reconstruction rests on is not complete. The catalog says there was a second volume. It vanished from the official shelves in the 1970s. Yet someone, in our own day, has been acting as if they've seen pages the rest of us have not. I first met the twins of Cypress Bend not in a story at all, but in air that smelled of paper and dust. In a Florida archive reading room, I opened a cardboard box labeled with a number and the words, Hayes, LDR Research Notes. Inside were brittle pages in a careful hand, references to a plantation west of Tallahassee, to colored twins who shared stripes, to a minister fretting about God's order. Tucked between them was a carbon copy of an article that never quite made it into the wider world. A catalog slip in a different box sent me after the Keene family papers. That trail led to another room, another gray carton. There were letters from Walter Keene about fever outbreaks, a draft to an unnamed medical society, and one loose sheet bearing the date October 1861, with a sentence that had no business in polite 19th century prose. Simultaneous lesions reported on distant twin, distance estimated 25 miles, discrepancy in time too small to attribute to chance. It read less like a conclusion than a confession. Someone, once, meant to show it to others, and then thought better of it. The Finding Guide mentioned a second volume of Keene's journal, Volume 2, 1861, 1863, donated 1920s, missing since 1973. A staff note, not meant for public eyes, added, possibly removed to private collection by unknown patron. That absent book is supposed to hold the rest of case number 14. Later entries hint that the twins' pain did not stop with them, that other bodies nearby picked up flashes of it. If those pages still exist, they're sitting in a dark cabinet in someone's house or a bank box where no one who bears the twins' surname can read what was done to their kin. While I was working through all this, a message came in from a listener in North Florida. Their people, they wrote, came from the old place out by the cypress swamp, and there was a family story about children who got sick in pairs. They mentioned modern twins in their own line, one living in Jacksonville, the other in Atlanta. As teenagers, one was shoved hard against a brick wall outside a school. Miles away, at almost the same hour, the second woke from a nap with a dark bruise blooming on the same shoulder. No injury anyone could see. Doctors called it stress. Their grandmother called it the old thing, and then told them, again, about the boys from the plantation who were whipped together whether they stood side by side or not. You can decide for yourself how much you believe. Nervous systems are complicated. Trauma runs down through generations in ways science is still learning to name. But it is striking how often the descendants of people once listed as property talk about aches and marks that no single life seems to account for. What is not in doubt is how the old system reacted. When white doctors saw something they could not measure, they turned it into a case. When white preachers saw it, they turned it into a warning. Either way, the aim was the same: keep control. The idea that enslaved black bodies might hold a connection that reached beyond chains, that would not sit inside any ledger. The people in the quarters handled it differently. They stitched the memory into songs, into nicknames, into the way a hand flew to the chest when thunder rolled. They passed along stories of the twins who hurt together, even when no court, no church, no medical journal would give those boys a line. If you don't want stories like this to disappear again the way Keene's second journal did, you know the small things that help. Leave a comment, share the video with someone who cares about this history, subscribe, and ring the bell so the algorithm doesn't bury it with lighter fare. More important than any of that, though, is taking these names and scars into your own conversations, your own family talk, so they don't stay trapped in boxes and hard drives. Before I finished digging, an archivist at a southern university pulled me aside. Off the record, they said they'd seen a private inventory for a donor's collection. On that list was one line: Keene Journal, Volunder 2. The owner, an old family, refuses access for ethical and familial reasons. So somewhere, in a climate-controlled room behind a locked door, may lie pages in which a 19th century doctor calmly describes how one black child was pushed to the edge of death twice, once for himself and once for his brother. Until those pages see daylight, what we have are the marks left on descendants' bodies and the gaps left in America's story. This has been the tale of the Florida twins whose bruises rose together, and it is only one among thousands of accounts that never made it into the textbooks, but still live on, as faint lines under the skin of a country that has never fully learned how to feel all of its own pain.